Okay, so today we're going to talk about the sixth mass extinction. And at the center of today's lecture is this question of whether or not we are actually in the sixth mass extinction. In order to answer that question, we have to know a little bit about what a mass extinction is and what the historical mass extinction events have been. We're mostly going to focus on the reading, the Durzo et al. 2014 reading that you did for today, but I am going to bring in some background information on other evidence. There's a wealth of evidence on this topic in the current literature, primarily coming out of biology, but also geosciences, as they're looking in the fossil record to understand these extinction events. Oh. Okay, so as I promised before, I am doing my best to post these goals and objectives for every class period. Do keep in mind, if you note, these objectives are written in a way that there is a verb associated with them, so describe, define. So these are things you should actually be able to do. And a great thing to do at the end of the lecture, at some time before the final exam, is to go ahead and make sure that you can do all of these things. And that will help you be more prepared for the test, and also will help reinforce learning, which is our ultimate goal. Okay, so I posted these questions. I hope you spent some time going through them before you watched this lecture and even followed my advice to go ahead and answer them, as that would be the ideal way to really fully grasp this material, especially since we can't be interacting with each other right now in a classroom environment. I'm trying to come up with different things that kind of mimic that and help you to process information, give you some chance to sort of bounce ideas and think about things before we're in a class. So if we were in class, I would probably spend some time, as you know, asking us to think through these. But this table comes from a reading or another article by Anthony Barnosky, published in Nature in 2011, which shows us our big 5 mass extinction events. So according to the best science that we have right now, there have been 5 historical mass extinction events. And they are all listed here in order, right? From the oldest one, the Ordovician event, all the way up to the Cretaceous event, approximately 65 million years ago. Note the Triassic event, around 200 million years ago, but then there's some range when the actual extinctions happen. The point that I want you to understand about this is part of this question here, right? So that's why I asked these questions. What qualifies as a mass extinction, right? So here we have, if you notice, about 47% of genera were lost, and an estimated 80% of species. Here, the Cretaceous event, 40% of genera, 76% of species. Up here, 35% of genera, 75% of species. So hopefully you're starting to see a pattern that a mass extinction is when you have the vast majority of species on the planet lost within a relatively short time period, right? So here it's saying that within 29 to 2 million years, right? So big time frame there, you're losing 35% of genera, right? And so in general, I've read quite a few papers that point to the 75% of species is a cutoff for a mass extinction event. So, you know, that is what we think of when we think of this mass extinction is that we've lost approximately 75% or more of species on the entire planet. So just think about that for a second, right? That's a really difficult thing for us to wrap our heads around, in part because there are a bunch of species on this planet that we don't come into contact with on a daily basis. I mean, if you look at even our foods now, we very much streamlined them. So we eat a couple different animal products, a couple different grasses, otherwise known as corn and wheat, and right. So we have a couple plant products that we eat, a couple animal products. And we're going to talk about this next week with sustainable agriculture and why not embracing the diversity of food products might be bad for us as a species. But so because we don't come into contact with a lot of species, and a lot of the species we see is on Animal Planet or whatever we have these days, it is difficult really to wrap our head around just how many species could be lost in mass extinction event, and by comparison, how many we seem to be losing today. So the other thing I want to point out with this table is historical causes, okay? So hopefully when you look at these, you see things related to, how about that, climate change, right? So Siberian volcanism, I'm sorry, that makes me want to giggle, the anthropologist in me. Global warming, right? Elevated carbon dioxide levels, calcification crisis in the ocean, potential impact in the Yucatan, thought to have had a global cataclysm and caused potentially rapid cooling, although I've read a bunch of really cool theories about that. But the point being, if you notice, all of these are a massive climate shift. So one of the things that you'll see and hear sometimes about climate change and kind of the rhetoric of telling us that this shouldn't be something we're concerned about is this sort of naturalness of the planet, right? You'll hear people say things like, well, the planet, the planet undergoes natural climate changes, and there's always these natural events, et cetera, and that is very much true. And I hope now at this point in the course, you do understand the science of those natural climate phenomenons. However, what is missing out of that argument is the extent to which humans have not been alive for most of those climate shifts. Note this: 65 million years ago, hopefully you remember from the beginning of the class, humans were not on the planet 65 million years ago. In fact, only our humanoid ancestors go as far back as a couple million years ago, right? And us Homo sapiens are confined to the last 400,000 years or so. And so us humans on the planet have evolved in more stable climate. And then our civilizations have really evolved in this massive stability of climate that we call the Holocene. And so the big concern being, of course, that we have these kinds of dramatic climate change events can impact all species on the planet. And there's and humans are intertwined in that with those species, and our way of life is intertwined with those species. And I think our current events really point towards how vulnerable we are as a species, right? And how vulnerable our systems are to changes that are happening on the planet. Okay, so how do we know this? How do we compare extinction rates? So that was a little bit of a long backstory here, but a little bit of the science. So this comes out of the article as well that I used to have students read, but I didn't want to give you 4 readings on this. You're welcome. Is basically looking at the rate of extinctions over a given time species, right? Time frame. So E over MSY, extinctions per million species years, okay? So this is something that was in a different article. But what is essentially done is they'll use the geological record to look at, and of course we have a fabulous fossilized geological record that allows us to understand things like the dinosaurs, which otherwise we would have no idea that there were dinosaurs on the planet, right? That's through our fossil record that we found those things. And we have other extinct species on the planet that we've been able to discover in this fossil record. And so what we do, well, rather these scientists, this is not the type of scientist that I am, but they will look at the rates of, so they'll look at the quantities of species that are in different levels of sediment, because as you already know from other things that we've learned, sediment layers typically relate to years back in history, right? So they can look at the different numbers of species and the diversity of species across different sediment layers, and they can essentially begin to construct a time scale historically of how quickly species tend to go extinct. And so what I mean by that is naturally species are going to be going extinct without some sort of major event that's causing a mass extinction. So if you look at those mass extinctions, that's a major, either major climatic shift or the impact of a meteor or some major things that are happening that cause this rapid extinction rate, right? But if you look at if you just consider on a sort of the normal processes of things, you will have species that are going extinct. So what they'll look at is the extinctions per millions of years versus this kind of baseline rate. And by looking at the baseline rate and comparing that to rates of extinction, they can start to answer these questions about whether or not we're having a faster extinction rate in the present than historically. Okay, so this gets us to our question of how big is our current extinction problem? And I believe this is the last graph from an article that you have not read. So this is Gerardo Ceballos et al. From 2015. I'm of course saying that name is over Spanish, but it could be Italian, I don't know. So how big is our current extinction problem? If you look at this data, right, and so again here, and you haven't read this article, so all you have is the caption, like I've been trying to teach you to think about in class. You have the caption, and you have the figures. So cumulative vertebrate species recorded as extinct or extinct in the wild by the IUCN in 2012. The graphs are going to show us the percentage of the number of species evaluated among mammals, birds, and reptiles, right? And then fishes, and all vertebrates combined, right? So we're seeing a conservative estimate in A, and we're seeing, a highly conservative estimate in A, and just a conservative estimate in B. Okay, so this is basically our understanding of species loss, either a highly conservative estimate or just a conservative estimate, right? And the dashed black curve, right, is showing our expected constant standard background rate of 2 per, again, this is our extinctions per million species year, right? So we're expecting 2 extinctions per million species year, and this is what we'd expect with the background rate over time. And this is what we're seeing, okay? And this again is our highly conservative estimate versus our just plain old conservative estimate. And again, you have to really kind of pay attention to the graph to be able to follow all of these things. But they're basically 2 different models that are being shown here. And what we see, probably not surprisingly, start of Industrial Revolution, we're seeing a massive growth in these extinction rates across all of these different animal phyla, okay? Okay, now on to the figures that we saw in class, or I'm sorry, that you saw in the paper, the Durso et al. Paper, right? So we have here the number of species defined by IUCN as currently experiencing decline, okay? So represented in numbers of individuals per 10,000 kilometers squared. So here we're seeing for mammals and birds, what is the spatial implications of global population decline, right? So if you see here, we've got, again, in what are some of these sometimes referred to as biodiversity hotspots, if you remember that graph that I showed you from the last lecture, we're seeing massive amounts of decline in a lot of those areas. But you also see that it is distributed across the globe. So it appears that some of our hotspot areas, again, keeping in mind areas with you know, good precipitation, hot, warm, moist areas tend to have more biological diversity. So we're seeing greater losses in those areas, but overall across the planet, this distribution of species loss. Okay, the article that you read for today talked a lot about decline in invertebrates. And I think it answered this question pretty well. This is a question that I think you should have been able to answer quite well from the reading. but you can test your knowledge after listening to this lecture or right now, look at your answer. The point being made about these 4 graphs in the paper is that, is that we've experienced rapid decline across different taxa, right? Different species taxa. So here you're seeing that there are, right, so this is showing us all of our invertebrate abundance, right? And so how that has been unequally distributed across different invertebrate taxa. They're paying a lot of attention to Lepidoptera, right, which is this taxa right here. And then we've seen a percent decrease, right, over 40 years in all of these invertebrate taxa, right? And so, right? And so one of the concerns, or one of the points being made by this, is that we're seeing insect decline in insect biodiversity or invertebrate biodiversity across the globe, and that this is particularly concerning given the role that insects play in our food web. And that's what really is going to show up throughout the rest of the article here, right? It's not just that insects are more important and that they're declining, but rather that insects are declining, and we should see this in relationship to other animals that are also the impacts across the food web. Okay, so this is where they get to the point about defaunation and how it is related to size differential. So hopefully you notice here, really the big theme of this figure is that you have larger, that if you're looking at our Anthropocene, which are these guys, right, you're noticing that the larger animals tend to be the more threatened ones, right? And so they're showing us here in the Pleistocene, right? So this, that were known to have gone extinct, and note that we're talking about the larger animals then. And then here in the current Anthropocene, the body mass of the animals that are known to have gone extinct, and then the ones that are already threatened, and then the non-threatened species. And what you see is these smaller animals tend to have less, that are less threatened in the Anthropocene than other animals. Okay, and they postulate in the article, so I just cut this little part down: small geographic range size, low reproductive rates, large home range size, and large body size recur across many studies in diverse taxa as key predictors of extinction, right? And that's one of the things that we see in particular here. So larger animals tend to have lower reproductive rates. Sometimes you need a large home range size to support a larger animal. So if you think of something like a tiger or a jaguar, you need quite a bit of land that is connected habitat to support them. And so those are key predictors of animals that will be disrupted and potentially go extinct in the Anthropocene. Okay, so here's this question. This is from the last paper, but looking here, right, if this is our sort of cutoff of a mass extinction, the question is, are we currently in a mass extinction, right? And so if you look at these, right, so here we're seeing these threatened species, right? So the white icons it says here, right, indicate species extinct and extinct in the wild over the past 500 years. The black icons add currently threatened species to those already extinct or extinct in the wild, the amphibian, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so if you're looking at these different species, right, trying to understand where we are at in terms of a mass extinction, right? Currently, no, we have not hit this 75% of all species threshold, right? So I guess the question is, okay, great. So are we good? And the answer is no, because what we're seeing is, again, going back to this. probably should have had this next, but let's go back to this for just a second, right? So think about this background extinction rate versus the trajectory of the extinction rates that we're on, right? And if extinction rates are very difficult, short of having some sort of massive thing that just wiped out all species on the planet at once, it's the type of thing that you're comparing how quickly something is happening in the present over, you know, large, long historical records, geological records. And so it's very difficult to pinpoint it's a difficult thing to be able to track while you're in the middle of it. And what we're seeing with a lot of our data, if you look at these sort of threatened species, right? So here it says amphibian percentage may be as high as 43%. Well, that's pretty darn high, right? Especially given that we're trying to track this in real time, potentially not knowing the diversity of species on the planet, et cetera. And so looking at these threatened, near extinct percentages of species, it definitely leads us to conclude that we're on the trajectory towards a mass extinction. So that if there were some sentient being a million years from now looking back, or 5 million years, or 100 million years from now looking back on our geological record, they would probably see something similar, right? If our current trajectory continues, they would see something similar to the types of things that I showed you on that first table in table 1. Okay, so this brings us back to that biodiversity question that I was lecturing on in last class period that I'm hoping to really hammer home, which is the why do we care about biodiversity and defaunation? And so what this graph is really showing us is this idea of a food web in more technical terms, right? And so what we're seeing here is the problem, right? What he was pointing to is that there's going to be a problem with larger animals, right? And those can actually cascade and impact the rest of the food chain. And a classic example of that is the removal of wolves as a keystone predator in much of the United States. And I'm not sure how familiar you all are with this example, but when you remove wolves, you tend to get an overabundance of deer, and those deer will clear out a forest of all the undergrowth and have really detrimental impacts on the rest of the forest, right? And so there have been some pretty contentious cases of reintroduction of wolves into certain areas to help those ecosystems recover better. But this is the type of thing that we would be looking at across the globe, and already are looking at across the globe as you see that these larger animals are threatened in many, many places. And then, of course, not to undermine that these functions and services also are going to cascade up the food chain. So if you are having, I know many people, you know, we began this article with insects, right? And that insects are still, you have a good number of insects to kind of fill out. If you think of that figure from last week, that some are going extinct, but then you have others that are going to be filling out certain roles in the food chain and in their ecosystems. But overall, we are seeing this massive decline in insects as well, particularly in regions, there's certain insects that are really thriving, and then there's others that are declining. And so, again, keeping in mind that it's this biodiversity that contributes to these diverse functions of an ecosystem, and that it's not just one, one species can't fulfill all niches in an ecosystem, and it's one of the reasons that we need the diversity. Okay, so also last point about this functional diversity, right? So remember that we've been using the planetary boundaries framework, and they talk about biodiversity in terms of genetic diversity and then functional diversity. Well, with the functional diversity, again, this is thinking about those roles that different organisms might play in an ecosystem. And we don't actually know what amount of biodiversity do we need to have in order to have the functional diversity of an ecosystem? And that's why that's that big question mark and gray area in the planetary boundaries framework. Is it that some pollinators that survive will be able to pollinate everything on the planet? Probably unlikely, right? But just how many pollinators do we need to lose until we're not able to have fruit trees anymore? We don't actually know. And this is going all the way back to the first day of class when we talked about the issues of the policy in your reading that was called the precautionary principle, right? So when we don't know things, sometimes it's best to take precaution and preserve what we can to make sure that we have a stable, resilient life and future for all, right? This is something that we certainly as a society do not agree upon. But scientists often feel pretty good about this principle, the precautionary principle, because there's a saying you've probably heard before, that the more you know, the more you realize how much you need to learn, or something along those lines, or how much you don't know. And so there's a lot that we've learned, and there's still a lot that we don't know. And so what we try to do is take what we've learned and guide a ship in the right direction. And unfortunately, sometimes people think, well, we need all the answers in order to make a decision. But as we're seeing in this current situation that we're in, there was plenty of information to guide us in the right direction, right? But people don't, it's not always going to benefit everybody. And so we have to think about what's best for us as a society and us as a planet moving forward, and perhaps a little bit less about what's best for individuals. Okay, so this last little thing, there's a clickable link on this. If you didn't discover that already, it'll take you to the IUCN Red List. And I just want you to spend some time exploring it. I'm going to create a little dialogue box, and maybe you can post in there any interesting things you learned about near threatened or critically endangered species near us, in Greenville, near where you're at, wherever you're at right now, and just spend some time exploring this webpage. All right, that's it for today. This was a long one, and we'll meet up again in next class, and I hope everybody's doing all right. Take care.